There is a meeting happening right now in an office somewhere where everyone in the room thinks the policy is wrong. Not a little wrong. Wrong in a way that costs real people real things. And one by one, they each nod along. Not because they agree, because they look around and see everyone else nodding. You have been in that room. Maybe not that exact room, maybe it was a family dinner where a comment landed wrong and the silence that followed felt like agreement. Maybe it was a team that kept running a process no one believed in. Maybe it was a social circle with an unspoken rule you kept performing because you were certain, absolutely certain, that you were the only one who found it strange. The silence around you felt like proof you were outnumbered. It wasn't. What you were living inside has a name: pluralistic ignorance. And once you see how it works, you cannot unsee it. It is the mechanism behind every norm you privately hate but publicly obey. It is what freezes dissent in institutions, in families, in whole societies, not through force but through a shared, silent misreading of each other. The frightening thing is not that it exists. The frightening thing is how simple it is to manufacture and how completely invisible it is from the inside. The term itself was introduced by sociologists Floyd, Allport and Katz in the early 1930s, studying attitudes about Prohibition-era norms. What they found was precise and unsettling. A large portion of people privately opposed a social norm, yet believed they were nearly alone in that opposition, because everyone around them appeared to comply. Compliance read as belief. Silence read as consensus. The norm held, not because people agreed with it, but because everyone assumed the others did. A fiction, collectively maintained by people who each believed they were the only one not convinced. Here is where it gets important. Pluralistic ignorance is not just something that happens to people. It is something that can be done to them. An institution, a culture, a controlling relationship. Each of these can be structured so that the silence is never broken. You keep people from comparing notes. You reward public agreement and punish public doubt. You make the cost of being the first to speak visibly higher than the cost of quietly suffering the norm. The silence, then, does your work for you. Every compliant face in the room becomes a wall that presses against everyone who might otherwise speak. Think about how this plays out in a workplace. A company runs a performance review process that everyone on the team privately considers arbitrary and demoralizing. Each person completes their forms, attends the calibration meetings, nods at the outcomes. In the hallway afterward, they say nothing direct. Maybe a joke, maybe a sigh, but nothing that names the thing. Why? Because the person they would say it to seems fine with it. That person seems fine with it because the person they would say it to seems fine with it. The norm holds at the surface while dissent circulates below, never finding a vent. And the people who designed the process never hear a word of it because the silence they created looks, from where they stand, exactly like agreement. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from this. Not the exhaustion of conflict, the exhaustion of self-management, the quiet, constant work of performing a belief you don't hold, of scanning every room for the one face that might reflect your own doubt back at you and never finding it. You start to wonder whether something is wrong with your reading of the situation, whether everyone else has access to some reason you are missing, whether you should trust them more than you trust yourself. That is not weakness. That is the mechanism doing exactly what it is designed to do. Imagine a woman, a Thursday afternoon, sitting at her desk after a meeting that just ended badly. She knows it ended badly. She watched 3 colleagues shift uncomfortably in their chairs. She saw the moment the project lead glossed over the numbers that didn't add up. She felt the room hold its breath. And then she watched everyone collect their notebooks and walk out without saying a word. She pulls up a blank document, stares at it, and types nothing. She is not afraid of being wrong. She is afraid of being the only one who is right. Most people who say they'd made their peace with a bad norm have only gotten too tired to carry the doubt out loud. That is not acceptance. It is the norm winning a different way. This is where the research takes a turn that matters. In 1976, psychologists Deborah Prentice and Dale Miller began a long series of studies on pluralistic ignorance in social settings, and what they found is the thing that changes the shape of this entirely. The norm doesn't just hold people in place, it actively distorts their sense of themselves over time. People who privately dissent but publicly comply start to absorb the public position. The performed belief bleeds into the real one. You say enough times with your body that you agree, and part of you begins to believe it. The compliance stops being a mask, it becomes a layer. Stop. Feel that. You have done this. You have performed a position in a room until you could no longer clearly remember what your original position was. That is not a character flaw. That is what long exposure to a false norm does. The Stoics had a word for the internal court where you answer to yourself, the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the part of you that ought to remain your own. Epictetus taught that other people can take nearly everything from you, but they cannot touch the judgment itself unless you hand it over. Pluralistic ignorance is a mechanism by which a room, silently and without any force, persuades you to hand it over voluntarily. Now consider the other direction. Consider what happens when one person speaks, not dramatically, not as a confrontation, just honestly. A 2009 study by Cynthia Wang and colleagues found that when even a single group member publicly expressed a view that contradicted the apparent norm, other members of the group rapidly updated their stated positions, often to align with the dissenting view rather than the original norm. One voice, not an argument, not a campaign. A single honest question, asked without aggression, collapses a false consensus the way a pin collapses a held breath. The silence was never as solid as it looked. It was load-bearing air. This is the asymmetry that most people never discover because they never test it. The norm feels like stone. It is actually paper, held in shape only by the collective agreement not to touch it. The moment someone touches it, the structure is visible for what it is. And once visible, it cannot hold. So here is the one thing. Not a strategy, not a framework. One act you can carry out of this room tonight, the next time you're in a meeting, a dinner, a conversation, and you notice that quiet, pressurized sense of everyone performing agreement, ask an honest question. Not a rhetorical one. Not an accusation wrapped in a question mark, a real one. Something you actually want the answer to. Something like, I'm not sure I fully understand why we do it this way. Can someone walk me through the reasoning? Or, quieter still, does anyone else find this part difficult? That's it. You don't have to be brave in the heroic sense. You don't have to be first and loudest. You have to be willing to let your honest question exist in the air for 3 seconds. That is the pin. That is all it takes. The woman at her desk on Thursday afternoon. She does not send a manifesto. She does not call anyone out. In the next meeting, when the numbers get glossed over again, she says, I want to make sure I'm reading these correctly. Can we look at the projection one more time? The room holds its breath for 2 seconds. And then the person to her left, who has been silent for 4 months, says, I had the same question. The paper structure folds. Not with a crash. with a sound like a long exhale. The silence you thought was only yours, it was never only yours. The room was full of people feeling it, each of them looking at you to see if you were fine with it, each of them performing fine so the others would think the norm was real. You were not the outlier, you were the majority, fragmented by the belief that you were alone. What collapses a false norm is not courage in the large theatrical sense. It is the willingness to ask one honest question before you convince yourself the silence means something it doesn't. You are someone who sees the mechanism now. That changes what you do next time you're in that room.